We're on Memdalid Omid Beis, and we're studying, as you recall, the statement of Rav Yosef in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, that in the case of Machsu Gushaso Liachar Shenises, and he violates the law of Lo Yuchal Baila Harishon Asher Shil Chaloshim Lekachta, the vlad that's born, for example, let's say a daughter is born from such an illegitimate marriage, is pogum lekuhuna, has the status of a chalol. And even according to Shimon HaTimni, who says that mamzerus only applies in a violation of chayvei krisis, but not in a case of chayvei lavim, that's only as far as psul kol is concerned. But as far as psul kahuna is concerned, where there's a psul of chalolus, there, even in chayvei lavim, there is a psul of chalolus. And now we're up to the kal v'chomer of Rav Yosef, which is, you'll see here on Daf Mem Daled Amid Beis, 4 lines down from the top. Mikal v'chomer me'almana. The Torah prohibits a kohen gadol from marrying an almana. And that's an isur lav, and also a violation of an essay. Uma almana lekohen gadol. That lav is relatively kal kuf lamed on a lower level, more lenient from other chayvei lavim. She'ein isura shava bakol. It's not an isur lav that applies to everyone. It applies to a very, very specific sector of the community, namely to an almana, to a kohen gadol. And nevertheless, the child from such a marriage, a bas, let's say, who was born, would be pogum lekuhuna, completely disqualified, has the status of a chalol lekuhuna. And that's derived from a pasuk in Vayikra Chaf Aleph, v'lo yechal zaro bi'amo. So let's take out the chumash and let's read it inside. At the beginning of Parshas Emor, the Torah says, Almana ugrucha v'chalola. And now we're talking about a kohen gadol, because Almana is uniquely prohibited in the case of a kohen gadol. And then the next pasuk says, V'lo zaro bi'amo. We see that the zera born from such a relationship, from the violation of kohen gadol and almana, is a chalal. The Torah says it explicitly. Lo yechal zaro bi'amo. So through the bia, the zera becomes posel l'kuhuna. And even though that's a violation of lav chein et shav bakol, zu, in the case of machzir gushas lach shenises, which is a higher level, more severe violation of lavim in the pyramid of lavim, sheisur et shav bakol, that's not an issue that's limited to any particular individual or sector of the community. Eino din shebno pogum. How much more so, says Rav Yosef, should the vlad, the bas, be psulach l'kuhuna? And this is the kal v'chomer of Rav Yosef. And the Gemara immediately is going to reject the logic of this kal v'chomer to such an extent that we have to figure out what Rav Yosef was thinking. Gemara says, Ikol mifrach, mala almana. In the case of almana l'kohen gadol, shekain hi atzma mischaleles. And we have a principle that havlad holech achara pogu. So therefore the bas of this almana, since she herself became a chalola, and that's derived from the fact that the Torah says lo yechalel, not lo yachel, but lo yechalel is an extra lamed there, zaro bi'amav. Mashma she'osa shnei chilulim, echad La v'yechel lezaro. So that means that La, she herself, becomes a chalola. And applying the principle of Havlad Holech Achar Pogum, the child is also a chalola in the case of a bas. That has nothing to do with Machzeh Gushasa. She's not mischaleles. So why should the Vlad be Pogum Lekahuna if the principle is Hakol Holech Achar Pogum? Where's the Pogum over here? It's very difficult to understand the logic of the Kal Vachomer of Rav Yosef. But in any event, we're going to see soon that the Gemara is going to slug up Rav Yosef for two other reasons. And then the Gemara is going to try to put this all together and defend Rav Yosef from the other two reasons, and then come back to the Pircha on the Kal Vachomer and see if we can defend Rav Yosef against this Pircha. But in any event, what does it mean, Hi Atzum is Chalot, she becomes a Chalola? That means that if the Kohen Gadol dies, she's not allowed to marry Kohen Hedger, or if she's a Bas Kohen, she can no longer return to her father's house to eat Truma. She's a Chalola. She's excluded from Kedushas Kahuna. And that means that even though her husband, the Kohen Gadol, dies, she can't marry a Kohen Hedger. She cannot eat Truma. And therefore, we're going to add another chumrah, and that is that Havlad is likewise a chalol. But in the case of Machzeh Gushaso, she doesn't become psula through this bia to kahuna. She could still marry a Kohen. And therefore, there's no reason to establish or generate a psul of chalol with regard to the Vlad of Machzeh Gushaso. And therefore, she can continue eating truma as a Bas Kohen, and after her husband dies, she can marry a Kohen. The Ode. So in addition to the Pircha on the Kal Vachomer, we're going to reject Rav Yosef for the following reason. The Torah says, Lo yuchal baila harishon asher shilcha loshav l'kach liyas l'isha achrei asher hu tama ki to'evahi. And the extra word he is a miut. He to'eva ksiv. He v'ein paneh to'eva. She's a to'eva, but not her children. They can marry kahuna. The Od, and further, let's reject Rav Yosef. The Sanya, based on a brisa, Hamachzeh Gushaso. After she got married to someone else, he remarries his grusha, and he violates the law of Yuchal Baila Rishon Loshav Lekachta. Vanose Chalutza, who violates by marrying his Chalutza the law of Lo Yivne's base Achiv, which we darshan Kevan Shalabana Shuv Lo Yivne. Vanose Krovas Chalutzasa. This according to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva on Amud Aleph, if you remember, had derived from a special pasuk that Beso means Chalutzasa. And he violates a lavdo raisa of Rabbi Akiva Omer Ein Ba Tfisas Kedushin, the Eino Tzrichem Eneget, the Psula Uvlada Pasuk. The kofin oso lahotzi. So according to Rabbi Akiva, in the case of krovas chalutzaso, where the Torah considers his chalutza to be like Ishto, and therefore he's prohibited from marrying her mother, her sister, her daughter in an Isur Lav, this results in number one, meaning there's no tfisas kedushin. This is Rabbi Akiva's unique shita. Number two, he psula linase lakuna, he nase zona. By violating this lav, which is derived from the drasha that upgrades chalutza to the status of ishto, meaning grushaso, she becomes a zona, and a zona is psula lakahuna. It says in the pasuk in Emor, Isha zonim chalolo lo yikachu. Uvlada pasuk. Likewise, the vlad of this marriage to Krovas Chalutzaso is pasul. She's a bas. She can't marry a Kohen because hakol holech achar pagu. And of course, we're going to force him to deliver a get to his wife because every time they have a relationship, they're violating a law. And that's the shita of Rabbi Akiva. Now we get to the dissenting view of the Rabbanim. V'chachamim omrim, God to machzir gushos le'achar shenises le'achar yeshlo ba kiddushin. There is tfisus kiddushin because the Rabbanim hold that kiddushin tosin b'chayvei lav and utzrichem and a get. Therefore, since there's valid kiddushin, she needs a get. And v'ikshera l'kuna, she could marry a Kohen. And Chachamim hold that she doesn't become a zona in the case of Chayvei Lavim, since the condition Tovsim of Vlad kosher, and likewise the Vlad is kosher. Now here we have to analyze what that means. Vlad kosher. Certainly it means that the Vlad is on a mamzer because there's no mamzerus from Chayvei Lavim according to the Chacham against Rabbi Akiva. But do we go a step further and assume Vlad kosher even lekahuna? And the Gemara clarifies leman lav lekuna. Shouldn't we not accept the interpretation that Vlad kosher means lekuna? And if that be the correct interpretation, we have now a brisa that's explicit that the Chachamim hold that ein mamzer michayvi lavim the ein haben pagum michayvi lavim, and the child is mutar lekuna, and that's against Rabbi Yosef. So this last objection to Rav Yosef, the Gemara addresses now, and the Gemara says, "Lo, the Brisa never meant to say that the ben or the bas is allowed to marry kahuna. La kol, when it says vlada kosh, there's no psul kol of mamzeres. But as far as the higher level of kedushas kahuna is concerned, there's a psul of kahuna." And once again, if that be the case, then we can support the approach of Rav Yosef, even in the light of this brisa. And Rav Yosef says that there's going to be a pgam lekahuna even when there's no mamzeres, there's no psul kol. So the Gemara says, "Hachi," if the brisa really means that the vlad is only kosher lekol, but not to kahuna. So then, when it says in the brisa he kshera, it says v'hi kshera uvlada kosher, and the Gemara assumes that both of those phrases, he kshera and vlada kosher, are referring to the same case, the same scenario, the same din. Laman. What does it mean, he kshera? Was there a havamina that would mean kshera lekahuna? Ilem called pshita. If you talk about whether she can marry into the Jewish faith, that's pshita. We never found that a woman becomes psul lekol as a result of violating an Isur Bia. Mishum Dezanya, she was guilty of znus, afsul lekol. Elolah, by process of elimination, we have to assume that the Bryce is coming to Mechadish Samachidush. It's not Shita that she's Kshera lekol, but rather she's Kshera lekahuna. And that's the phrase, he kshera. Now let's go to the phrase vlada kosher. Umidehi kshera lekuna, vlada nami kshera lekuna. And once again, we have an objection to Rav Yosef, who says that the vlad is pogum. So Gemara answers the following. Mide area hakadis of hakadis. This is what we usually call litzadim katani. When it says he kshera, it means she's kshera lakuna. But when it says that the vlad is kosher, that's kashus lakal, not lakuna. And although this is a little bit of an exceptional style or literary style of brisa, but nevertheless, in this particular brisa, we have to apply that unusual rule of hakadisa, meaning litzadim katani. Why? Let's go back to the reisha of this brisa. I'm going to prove to you that in the reisha we must apply the principle of hakadisa and hakadisa. The katani reisha, with regard to Rabbi Akiva in the reisha, it says he psula uvlada pasul. And we're going to soon see that those two phrases, he psula, vlada pasul, are litzadim katani. He psula laman, is it lakal or lakuna? Ilema lakal. That doesn't make any sense. Mishum dezanya ifsula lakal. We never found that a woman who engages in a biasura becomes psul lakal. I mean, there is such a thing as a zona, but that's only for kahuna, not for kol. Elalav, we have no choice but to interpret that when it says he psula, it means psula kahuna. She becomes a zona as a result of the Isur Bia of Chayve Lavim, and she can no longer marry a Kohen. Now let's go on to Vlad Apostle, and let's see if, in the words of Rabbi Akiva, Vlad Apostle, we can be consistent and assume it means Psula Kahuna. Laman, Elam, if you're going to say Lekahuna, and that would maintain the consistency. And the symmetrical nature of this brisa and its literary style, then you're telling me, Holekahol, that the word Vlad apostle, that word apostle is referring to kahuna, not kahal, because again, kahuna is always a higher standard. Well, that can't be. L'kol kosher? Ha'amar Rabbi Akiva, havlad mamzer. Rabbi Akiva's opinion is that from chayve lavim, the vlad becomes a mamzer. Ela pshita. Therefore, we must interpret that when the brisa says havlad pasul, lakol, so now we have two phrases here. We have the phrase of he psula and havlad pasul. We interpreted he psula as referring to kahuna, because there's no such thing as a psul kol through a biasura. So you're referring only to psul kahuna. That's all you have. There's no possibility of psul kol in a case of chayve lav with regard to her. And if the he psula means la kahuna, and now we go to Vlad Apostle. At Vlad Apostle, we said has to refer to kol, because we're going according to Rabbi Akiva that the product of a violation of Chayve Lavin is Apostle called the Torah's mamzer. Then we have another example of hakadis of a hakadis. Two phrases contiguous, each one means something else. And therefore, we could say that in the Sefer, when it says Vlada kosher, it means kosher only lakal, but pagum and disqualified lekahuna, as Rav Yosef holds. Now we had another kasha, which was the second of the three kashas, objection against Rabbi Yosef, from the word to'ev. So the Gemara says, he to'ev anami. I can answer up that question as well. He to'ev v'yein sarasa to'ev, which means the following. If a man was machzir grushaso liachar shenises liach, and he has another wife, so this person who violated the Isser of machzir grushaso, we'll call Reuven, not only was he machzir grushaso, he has another wife, a legitimate wife. Now he dies, and these two ladies fall for Yibum to Shimon, his surviving brother. Shimon cannot be miyabed the woman who was machzir, who was grushas lachar shenises, but he can be miyabed hatzara, the other wife. So that's called the ein sarasa toev. Now, the reason why he cannot be miyabem the wife is because of the famous kal v'chomer that we had more than once, that in muter lo nesra be isa vadei shetiyasa, lo ze vadei tiyasa. If she's asura to the deceased, then how much more so to the young? Aval banei toevim. However, again, in defense of Rabbi Yosef, the children who are born from this marriage are in fact toeva. The Sarah is not a toeva, but the children are excluded from kuhun. But now we go back to the first objection, which was the most fundamental one against Rabbi Yosef, namely a pircha on the kal v'chom, ela almana kasha. We still have to reject the logic of Rav Yosef in the Kal V'chomer. It's not compelling because we have a pircha mali almana sheken hiyatzon mischalelas. As we said earlier, the almana becomes chalola. She cannot marry kahuna. She cannot eat truma. That has nothing to do with machzir grushasa. Machzir grushasa does not become sula with this bia to kahuna. So therefore, we cannot derive the pagam of the child from the din of almana l'kohen gadol, because almana l'kohen gadol is another application of the principle of hakol olech achar hapagum. She becomes chalola, as we derive from the pasuk, and the vlad becomes or a chalol. And now the Gemara has rejected the kal v'chomer of Rav Yosef. And the Gemara is going to make an attempt now at revamping Rav Yosef in a more logical fashion. So according to Shimon HaTimni, keep in mind, he holds that ein mamzeres elo michayve krisis, but not michayve lavin. The Gemara is saying that in the case of machzir grushaso, the ben is not pogum. She herself doesn't become a chalola, and therefore even the ben is kosher l'kuhun. Eloi itmar. So what are we going to do with Rav Yosef? Let's rewrite the text of Rav Yosef. Hachi itmar. This is what Rav Yosef had in mind. Oh, Rav Yosef, Rav Shimon Rebbe, hakol modim. Even Rabbi Yoshua, who says that there's no mamzeris other than chayve misas bezdin, but not from chayve krisus. The bal chayve krisus havlad pogum. Even Rabbi Yoshua is going to agree that although there's no psul kol in the case of chayve krisus, but nevertheless there is a psul kuhuna. Mana kol modim. Rabbi Yoshua, the Afagav the Rabbi Yoshua Mamza Michayve Krisus, the Hida Mamza Lo Havi, Pogum Mi Havi, the Kal V'chomer Mi Almon. Umal mana l'kohen gadol. She'en isura shava bakol. Right? It's only to a kohen gadol. Almana is only asur to one person on the face of the earth, the kohen gadol. Is b'na pagum if she marries this almana, a kohen gadol, the child, the daughter, let's say, for example, from that product of that marriage is halal. She's excluded from kahuna. She cannot marry a kohen, etc., etc. And that we derive, if you remember, from the pasuk Yichal Zaro B'Yamot, is how much more so in the case of Zo, which is Chayve Krisus, She'isura Shava Bakol, Eno Din Sheb'na Pagum. V'chi Tema, maybe you'll suggest the following Pircha on the Kal V'chomer, like we had earlier, Mal Almana Shekain Hiatzim Mischaleles. And now we're going to differentiate between Machzir Gushaso, Liachashenis, where we said that Eino Nifseles Bibia Zula Kahuna, and therefore the Vlad is not Pogum because Hakol Holich Achar Pogum. In contrast, in a case of a Chayve Krisus, there she herself becomes Psula Kahuna. We don't call it a Chalola, but we call it a Zona. Is Mal Almana L'Kohen Gadol Shekain Hi Almana Atzum Mischaleles. Right, we saw that the Torah says that if a woman who's an almana has a relationship with a Kohen Gadol, she becomes mischaleles. And that was from the extra lamed of lo yechalel, that he atzma mischaleles. She becomes a chalol. She cannot marry a Kohen. So therefore, if the Kohen Gadol dies, she's not allowed to marry a Kohen hedjot. And she can't eat truma, etc., etc. Is therefore a kol holich achar pogum, and the children also become chalol. They cannot marry a Kohen. But in the case of Chayve Krisus, ein hi atzma mischaleles, according to this v'chitema, according to this Havamina, and the Gemara says no, that's not so. But rather, Kevon Sheba'ola Asa Zona. All right, she's not a Chalola, like in the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol. But nevertheless, she becomes a Zona. A Zona is Psuli Nasi L'Kuna. She can't marry a Kohen, she can't eat Truma. She has the same Chumrah as an Almana L'Kohen Gadol. And now we can derive the Kal V'chomer. So this is the new reinterpretation of Rav Yosef, and we're talking about Chayve Krisus, a Liba de Rav Yeshua. There's no Mamzerus, but there will be Psul Kahal, and she herself becomes a Zona. Not like Machzir Gushaso, Liachash Nises, where we said that she does not become a Chalora, and of course she's not a Zona, so she doesn't become Psula Bebia Zula Kuhuna, but in the case of Chayve Krisus, she becomes a Zona. The Psula Li Nase Lakuhuna. Now there's a very interesting Rashi here, Asa'a Zona. Because Rashi himself asks the question that we addressed. Why is it in the case of Machzir Grushos Lachash Nises, we don't apply the principle of Asa'a Zona? And Rashi answers, based on a Gemara later on, that Ema Nivel Lepasala Machzir Grushos Umishane Zar Etzlame Karabeina. So when do we apply the principle of nivel apostle? She becomes a zona. That's only in a case of zar etzlamei kara, whereas machzik b'shos lachash niseis is not a zar etzlamei kara. Initially, he could have married. That's Rashi. So the Achronim are medayik from this Rashi that Rashi is telling us that Dafka Machzik B'Shosah does not become a zona. And therefore, we don't assume that B'nah is Pogum. But other Chayvei Lavim, which could fit under the category of Zar Etzlamei Kara, would, through the violation of that lav, make her into a zona. And then we might be able to learn this Kal V'chomer from Almana, that the Vlad becomes Pogum L'Kuhuna. Now here, we have Tosfos Dibur Maskal Asod Zona. We're not going to go through the entire Tosfos, but there is a very important point there that we should mention here. The Gemara is saying that according to Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that the Vlad of Chayvei Krisus is still kosher l'kol, there's no psul mamzerus. Yet ain't kedushin topsim b'chayvei krisus, even according to Rabbi Yeshua. Why? Because the Gemara says that as a result of be'ilah of a woman with chayvei krisus, she becomes a zona. Tosfos points out the shem zona depends on tfisus kedushin. And if the Gemara is insisting that I saw zona, then for sure ain't kedushin topsim. This is a pella. According to Rabbi Yeshua, even though the Vlad, I'll say it the other way around. The way it comes out, Lamaskot, according to Tosfos, Rabbi Yeshua agrees that there's no tfisus kedushin in chayvei krisus, and yet the Vlad is not a mamzer. Well, now we have a precedent to create two different dinim out of one din. We would think it's all one din. If there's tfisus kedushin, there's no mamzerus. There's no tfisus kedushin, there's mamzerus. Now we're saying something totally different. That in chayvei krisus, Rabbi Yeshua, there's no tfisus kedushin, but on the other hand, there's no mamzerus. You need a chayvei mises bezdin for mamzerus. As Rayas here to prove that everybody agrees that in chayvei krisus there's no tfisus kedushin, and the Gemara says there's a zona. That means that there's no tfisus kedushin. Now, later on, the Gemara seems to assume that mamzerus depends upon tfisus kedushin or not tfisus kedushin. Like the Gemara is going to say that even Shimon HaTimni would agree that in the case of Eved v'Goya Bal Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is a mamzer because ain't kedushin tosim be Eved. We see clearly that mamzerus depends upon tfisus kedushin. So forget about Chumas Havera, right? The Shita of Yeshua is in order to get Mamzerus, you need the highest level of Chumas Havera, namely a Chiv Misa. Forget about that. If we're saying that according to Rabbi Yeshua, there's no Tfis Kedushin and Chayvei Krisus, then the child has to be a Mamzer. For example, Eved v'Yakum Shabal Bas Yisrael, the child is a Mamzer according to that day because Ein Kedushin Tosim be Eved v'Goy. Omar Rabba Bar Bachana Rabbi Yochanan Kol Modim B'Eved v'Yakum Shabal Bas Yisrael Shavlad Mamzer. And that means that you don't need Chayvei Krisus. All you need is eat Tfisas Kedushin in order to generate Mamzeris. Mana Kol Modim Shimon HaTimni, the Afagav the Omer Shimon HaTimni. It's a Mishnah Later on in Memtes, Ein Mamtz B'Chayve Lavim, Hani Mili, here we turn to Daf Mem Hey, B'Chayve Lavim de Tafsi Be Kedushin. That's all Chayve Lavim. The Vlad is kosher l'kol. Because Kedushin are Tovsim, but Aval Hocha B'Evid V'Yakum Shebal Bas Yisrael came into a Tafsi Bu Kedushin. There's no Tfisis Kedushin. It's Kechayve Krisis Tom. They're similar enough to Chayve Krisis that the Vlad is a Mams. Okay, so this is where we'll stop here on Meisvei on the top here of Memheim. Thank you very much, and a good night.